Thank you so much. It's nice to be back out here in Manitoba. Thank you for having me to speak. I was here 2 or 3 years ago as well, talking about crop insurance. And I find these conferences so valuable, both for learning and for networking. It's at that conference where I met Kim Cornish, and she was sharing details of her soil organic carbon mapping project across Alberta. And after that conference out here in Brandon, Kim and I were able to share data between crop insurance payouts and soil organic carbon and really analyze how soil health is relevant to production, yield, and risk within agriculture. So that's been a fascinating project that came about strictly because of networking here. So thank you so much for having me back again. My name's Stuart Chutter. Like in the introduction, I farm in Saskatchewan, but I work out of Alberta for AFSC, which is the provincial crown corporation that looks after crop insurance, agri-stability, and business risk management programs in Alberta. In Saskatchewan, I custom graze cattle on perennial forages, and just this year I expanded and bought a small Saskatoon berry orchard. It's about 30 acres of Saskatoon berries, and they got sold into Last Mountain Jam this year. So if you're at Costco and you see Last Mountain Jam, Saskatoon berry jam, grab a bottle. That likely came from my farm. And then some of it is also in a U-pick. So if you're looking for berries next July, come pick in July. I call myself a soil conservationist. I moved out to Saskatchewan in 2012 and rented a farm for several years before buying a farm around Melville. And at that time, I had no knowledge of soil health or how it affected production or risk or the resilience of my farm and my business. And that's when I really got interested in regenerative agriculture, the principles of soil health, and its effects on my farm. Outside of that, I'm a runner, and I love running mountain marathons, ultra marathons. The 100-mile distance is what really intrigues me, so that if I'm not on the farm or at work, I'm running somewhere. I'm going to talk today about business risk management programs and policy, and specifically with relevance to grasslands, and just give some context of the current state of how these programs function in terms of supporting grasslands in Canada, and also where some significant gaps are that I'm sure many in the room are familiar with or frustrated with at times. So I'm going to start with why this is so important to me and how I found that on my farm, how important grasslands are and something worth protecting. I really enjoyed Jenny Harris last night from White Oak Farms or Acres. Years ago, they did a lifetime analysis of the carbon in their beef production and compared it to Impossible Beef. I'm sure many people in the room are familiar with that. And that inspired me to do a very similar thing on my farm, a much lower cost analysis, but looking at soil health and monitoring changes in soil organic carbon from the time when I bought my farm in 2017 until 2022. So the farm I bought was cultivated land, fully tilled, a very tight crop rotation. At that time, I didn't have much knowledge on soil health and the principles of soil health. I bought the farm not knowing I was successful buying it because no one else really wanted that soil. It was about 2.8% organic carbon. And over the next 5 years, I incorporated diversity, polycrops, seeded it to perennial grasslands, and added cattle for grazing and rotational grazing. And by 2022, the organic matter on that same land was now 5.2%. So following some very broad metrics in the Harris, their family lifetime cycle calculation of carbon in beef, I did something similar on my farm. So looking at that soil organic matter increase in my soil and knowing that the top 6 inches of soil weighs about 2 million pounds and that 58% or so of that soil organic matter is carbon. Over those 5 years on average, that was 3,233 metric tons of carbon that had been sequestered in my soil. Now that is by grazing cattle, and we know that cattle emit carbon, and in Canada, that's about 11.4 kilograms of CO2 equivalent per pound of beef produced on the farm. And that's everything on the farm, through a feedlot, trucking to the grocery store, the whole life cycle to get to the consumer's plate. So if I extrapolate that across the beef that I produced on my farm, that was about 1,368 metric tons of emissions per year. So 3,233 sequestered, less some emissions, and doing that math, 1,865 metric tons of carbon was being net sequestered in my farm, even after accounting for everything to get that beef to the consumer's table. And that's about the equivalent carbon footprint of about 120 Canadians. So that was my journey in really understanding the importance of grazing, grasslands, in environmental solutions, climate resiliency, and what I value and what I want to be a part of in farming. And this was happening because of beef and because of perennial grasslands. Now working in policy, a part of my job is looking at things on the aggregate and what is the bigger picture and what's happening on the larger scale across provinces or across Canada. And that same analysis can be done on a broader scale, looking at the effect of grazing on soil carbon in land in the aggregate. So that similar analysis was done at the University of Alberta last year, finding that land in Alberta that has been grazed has 8.5% more carbon in it because of grazing. So that's not just correlation or looking at land that's been grazed compared to land that's not been grazed. That's also segregating out other data like rainfall, climate. So to strictly understand what is the effect of grazing in Alberta on soil carbon. And the results were an 8.5% increase because of grazing. So what does this have to do with business risk management programs? Programs like crop insurance, agri-stability. What do we take from this in terms of grasslands and what these programs are supposed to be achieving in Canada? Right now, the business risk management policies across Canada are governed by the Sustainable Canadian Agriculture Partnership. And this is the first time these programs have values in them of, like that word sustainable that leads at environmental values, biodiversity values, social values, removing barriers to agriculture for farmers. This is the first partnership where these programs also have those values beyond just financial risk management in agriculture. And if we look at that value of preserving biodiversity, solutions for carbon cycles, and protecting grasslands in Canada, are these programs serving that purpose, protecting those grasslands, especially when we are seeing so much news about decreasing cow herd in Canada, the loss of grazers, and the conversion of perennial grasslands. And so this brings me back to one of my main jobs in policy in Alberta, is trying to look at what solutions are there to protect the grazing industry. Where do we currently stand? Are monies currently going to protect those industries that steward our grasslands? And that's what I'm going to be sharing a bit today. So on the slide here is historical crop insurance in Alberta for 2021 and 22. So 2021 was a severe drought in Alberta. And if we look at where funds are going to, about $2.1 billion was dispersed in indemnities for annual crop production. And in that same year, only $155 million was directed to perennial grasslands. This is despite 7.5 million acres of perennial grasslands being insured. And so why is that happening? Why is so little dollars going towards risk management for perennial grasslands? And if we look at our coverage levels in Alberta, average coverage on annual crop production across all crop types is about $450 an acre, but coverage for perennial grasslands only about $57 per acre on average. So when we look at bigger picture policy objectives of protecting grasslands, avoiding grassland conversion, stewarding native grasslands, there's definitely a financial incentive within risk management policy that there's very little risk management for those grasslands compared to if they were to be converted. So the next thing I looked at is ultimately where is this money flowing to? When we look at our programs, crop insurance, agri-stability, agri-invest, these business risk management programs, are they flowing to industries that protect grasslands, or where do they ultimately end up? And that's where, if those dollars are aggregated, for every dollar that flows into annual crop production through these programs, about 17 cents flows to the livestock sector across Canada. And that is despite farm cash receipts or economic contribution of the livestock industry being smaller than grains and oilseeds, but not significantly. And I don't highlight this to take away from grains and oilseeds or have a battle between the two. There's definitely need and importance for annual crop production, and business risk management for crop production is a win for the livestock industry as well. So equal and fair, I don't think is necessarily an objective, but clearly a gap to recognize. And then bringing that back to policy objectives, again, going back to that Sustainable Canadian Agriculture Partnership with clear government objectives of preserving grasslands, preserving biodiversity. What effect are these programs having, or what's the ultimate outcome of that? Are these achieving those goals? And if we look at grassland conversion rates or pasture acres in Alberta, which is the green line, and then we look at financial support to the cow-calf cattle sector in Alberta, this is not causation. Like, there's all sorts of factors that affect pasture conversion rates. But we can clearly see that when these industries aren't supported in times of disaster, we do lose our prairie grasslands. And then if we look outside of Alberta and across Canada, it's a very similar story of losing grasslands, losing pasture acres, and how significant this is during times of industry financial stress, and how correlated the loss of pasture is with the financial well-being of a grazing farm. And so this leads to a hypothesis: if those producers who were grazing land and stewarding these grasslands had more effective risk management tools, would that lead to a much lower rate of grassland conversion? This analysis was done by the Canadian Agriculture Policy Institute, and their last comment is what really resonates with me, is that this loss in pasture is happening when livestock disappear from the area. And I'm such a believer and such an advocate that one of our best policy tools for protecting grasslands in Canada is policy that protects the beef producer who are stewarding these grasslands. So in Alberta, we've been working hard to try and solve this problem. It's a complex problem to improve livestock risk management tools. We're very good at delivering crop insurance when we know the yield that comes out of a combine. It's much harder when you don't know the yield because a cow ate it. So we're looking at how can we improve that precision of risk management tools when we don't actually ever know how much pasture or forage is grown out there. So right now in Alberta, our forage insurance program is based around weather stations, and we're continually trying to reduce the distance from weather stations to the insured acres so that we can get a better approximation of yield from that weather station. But we're also learning lessons that to accurately assess what's going on the farm, it's not just the distance to weather stations, it's also other variables. How can we include that in the yield prediction? So in 2022, we added an extreme heat trigger. So when temperatures are very, very hot, we will, in our calculations of expected forage yield, will reduce equivalent precipitation because that precipitation is likely not getting to the plant to support forage growth. So we're trying to move away from just measuring rainfall and moving towards measuring how much moisture is reaching the plant for effective forage growth. The other element we've changed in 2023 is moving to monthly payments. So in years of disaster and forage shortfalls, instead of sending payments out at the end of the year, sending them out throughout the growing season as we can assess weather conditions so that producers who need to buy feed or make up feed shortfalls can make those decisions within the year before everybody's looking for feed in the fall. And there's still a long ways to go and still a lot of improvements to make, but we are seeing some early indication that this is moving towards a solution. In 2023, if we just look at participation rates, so the graph on the right side of the screen, for 2024, over 40%, just over 40% of the province's perennial acres were insured. And this is the first time we've gotten anywhere near 40% and beyond, but it's still relatively low. So comparing that to annual crop production, typically 70 to 80% of annual crops in the province are insured. So participation in perennial products is very, very low. So we can't get support out to producers without participation, but we also need to have effective tools to work so that there's a reason to participate. But we are seeing an improved trend in that with these tweaks and changes to forage insurance products. And not only in participation rates, but also in terms of what is actually going out to these producers and the volume of money to support grasslands and perennials when it's needed. So in 2023, which was a severe drought everywhere, but in Alberta for us, that was a disastrous year for forage production. So even with only about 35% of the province participating in crop insurance. It still sent out $326 million to forage producers. And in context, that's over double the agri-recovery that was sent out in that year. And if we take like average stocking rates across the insured acres in 2023, that came out to about $500 a cow. So we're starting to get to a point where this is meaningful support in a year when it's needed. And that ultimately is the goal. There's still lots of gaps in business risk management and how it supports grasslands and grazing industries, and that's something in Alberta we're really trying to be a part of finding solutions for. I bring up the Guelph Statement, which is what political leaders across the country, provinces, and the federal government have agreed to as the guiding principles of what these programs are supposed to serve. And there's three pillars: the environment, the economic, and then also some social goals as well within these programs. But I really highlight under the environmental, biodiversity and protecting sensitive habitats are key things that governments are trying to achieve with these programs. So there's clearly a case for improved programs and policy that's targeted for protecting grasslands in Canada. The other element of it that's very relevant to the beef industry are some social goals. So governments across Canada have agreed that these programs should also serve to remove barriers to equity-seeking farmers. So removing barriers to agriculture for women in agriculture, for Indigenous farming, and other demographics in Canada. And that's relevant to the beef industry and how advocating for change may be, as livestock is the largest participation rate of women in agriculture, and same for Indigenous agriculture in Canada. Reserves in Canada are one of the largest land managers of grasslands. So when looking at the importance of programming for grasslands and protecting grasslands, there's the economic rationale, there is the environment rationale, and there is the social rationale that grazing industries really need improved support under these programs. So that's what I had to share today. I don't have solutions or proposals that I came to share, but rather to want to be a part of conversations continuously of what risk management for grasslands looks like, because that is something so important to me, but also, as we've seen, so important to the governments across Canada administering these programs. And if the right messaging and the right advocacy support for grasslands really does achieve a lot of their goals. So thank you so much, and if there's any questions, I'd be happy to take them. Thank you.
Thank you, Stuart. I'm sure there's going to be a lineup. One of the questions I had was, you're talking about the ranchers being stewards of the grasslands and how important they are. Is there any consideration for conservation programs? NCC, ducks, for example. The provincial organizations are trying to do some things. What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, great question. I mean, the short answer is in my role, my role is in business risk management programs, so insurance and income stabilization programs. So conservation isn't directly underneath that. But I think that's why why I'm so interested in these conversations, because there's challenges with, there's so many challenges of effectively managing risk in a grazing system by using crop insurance and other programs that have largely been developed for annual crop production. Is it the wrong tool? Are there other tools that need to become a part of the conversation for long-term solutions? So I don't have an answer for your question, but those are the type of questions that we need to be asking.
Paul, I know you have a question, and I was going to ask the same one, so take her away.
Okay. Yeah, thanks, Mike. A few of us last night were talking about livestock price insurance, the LPI program. Do you see that as an effective tool? And to me, right now we have the one hedge program, but maybe there could be other options. And would there be an appetite amongst Alberta producers to look at different tools that could be put out by the federal government?
Yeah, great question. And that's, again, one to really understand how the risk of beef producers or grazing industries can be insured. And that's what makes the solution so hard, is under crop insurance, it is a production insurance product, so it's insuring production. And what I hear from beef producers and livestock producers in general is the key risk is not production. Yes, you might average so many pounds of saleable product every year, but that's not, and it's important to maintain that or maximize that, but that's usually not the key risk that affects the success of the farm or not. Often it's more pricing risk or input cost risk, like forages or forage shortfalls. So production insurance or crop insurance as we know it, there's not really an easy tool for the livestock producer to manage those risks. Price insurance is a tool, and an effective tool for managing price risk. I mean, a conversation that frequently comes up with that is it is expensive, it is not a cost-shared insurance product. And so when we look at where government monies are going to support industries, it's not going into that product. And that is because under trade agreements, insurance products for agriculture are allowable if they're production-based, but not price-based. So if it's a price-based tool, there's a whole nother obstacle of trade. There is a tool, a new product coming out that I've been following closely and trying to really understand in the States, which is a wean calf revenue insurance product. And that takes into account production and price and is ensuring revenue as a trigger. So there are options to evaluate within insurance. But yes, I think LPI is a great tool. But again, it's not the full tool that's individually capturing price and cost and production risk.
What about using an existing tool that we have, agri-stability? What kind of work are you doing with that to make it useful? Because right now I don't see it as being an extremely useful thing for most livestock people and farmers in general.
Absolutely, great question. Like going back to what are the key risks of a grazing enterprise, assuming I'm hearing it right, and it's not necessarily production, but pricing and costs are more relevant to profitability and the more key risks to insure. So that brings us back to then, okay, the more appropriate solution is likely some sort of margin-based program, something that captures revenue and insurance combined. And that's the intention of agri-stability. What I hear frequently as the frustration with agri-stability is as producers move away from conventional feeding systems, as they're bale grazing, corn grazing, extensively grazing deep into the winter, a lot of those expenses are no longer eligible. So if you move away from buying feed and move into renting land to custom plant corn for winter grazing, it's the feed costs to feed the cow herd, but they flow through ineligible expense items. So in Alberta, we've been looking to we have evaluated that of how can we more appropriately capture the input expenses of a grazing enterprise when those grazing expenses are not flowing through eligible expense items. And then also evaluating how we treat feed inventories and intermediate inventories and how those, what we find oftentimes distort payment timeliness in those disastrous drought years when prices skyrocket and producers may have shortfalls of feed, but the price is so high that we're calculating positive inventory adjustments that push them out of support positions. So great question. And no solution to provide now, but an awareness. That's why I wanted to come here today, was awareness of those problems within the programming.
Blaine, if you'd like to speak.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Very happy to see the first slide and the second slide you put up there, Stuart, to show the carbon sequestration. I think, 8 out of every 10 people in this province live on concrete, and the knowledge of ecosystem processes is extremely poor, especially amongst people who make decisions for us. And I think it's incumbent upon every one of us to be aware of numbers like that and shout it from the rooftops. So I'm very, very happy to see that, people like yourselves in government service are coming up with numbers like this and sharing it with us, because I think this is the kind of ammunition that we need to help make sure that we have policies that do work for ecosystem processes. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Scott?
Hey there. I guess I wondered, we listened earlier this morning about our neighbor to the south that's getting $10,000 a year for this and 10 for that. I wondered if you see anything that you guys are doing really well, or you see something else across Canada that we need to be pushing our MASC or our BRM programs towards doing, that you think is a really good thing in terms of keeping grass from under the cultivator kind of thing? Like, what are we missing in Manitoba?
Yeah, Manitoba specifically, I don't have an answer to that, and I guess that's, I feel kind of useless up here talking, but I don't have an answer in general. Like, that's the process. That's the problem to solve, is the tools we have may not be, are they the right tools? If they're not capturing the risk, what a tool look like? What can we look at around Canada, around the world? Does that tool exist, or do we need to figure it out? And if we look across Canada, we see different sorts of strategies of addressing forage insurance, but all with the same fundamental problem of we don't actually know the production. So we're all trying to figure out different indicators or estimates of how much pasture grew without actually knowing it, because it's not baled or it's not going through a combine, it's going through a cow. So we don't know your average long-term production, and we don't actually know what grew out there. So every different province, whether it's weather stations, what are the calculations behind those weather stations? Is it grazing days? Is it using proxies of other crops where if hay crops fail, pasture is proxied off of that? Or if barley silage fails in your area, insurance is proxied off of that. So we can look across Canada and see all sorts of different strategies to get to that point, but I feel like we're all at that same point of it's close and it's better than nothing, but it's not risk management and it's not what's actually happening on the farm. And that's the problem to solve. I'm good till I'm done.
I was just asking Stuart how long he wanted to keep answering questions. Guy?
Yeah, so one question I guess is, I mean, ensuring perennial pastures, how would you sort that out? Like, would it reward poor management, or how would you even sort that out? Because I could have grass, but my neighbor that opens the gate May 1st and they're on there all summer, then, oh, he's out of grass. So he has no grass, but I have grass. How do you figure that out?
Yeah, great question. I mean, in most agriculture insurance products, it will be based on individual history. So if you're having low production in your history because of poor management decision makings, that shows up in coverage levels and support levels. Oftentimes in insurance products, if there's new producers, they're often covered at an area average. And so that's not precise. If they're above average or below average, they either won't get that reward or won't get penalized because they're coming in as a new producer. So all of what you said is true and relevant, and the challenge of how do we best know what's growing on your farm when a cow eats it, and knowing what your history and your production capacity is based on your management.
Thank you.
Lucette?
So Stuart, this question, it's kind of an unconventional question, I think, but as we're looking at the slides and the information that you have collated for us, there's an aspect of the insurance model that, and please don't misunderstand me, it's a tool for producers for sure. We've been beneficiaries of livestock insurance and agri-stability and what we call rainfall insurance under the crop insurance model. So it is definitely a tool that we have benefited from. My question revolves around a dependency as part of risk management. A tool can really help, but the tendency for producers to produce with that in mind solely, that there is this tool that becomes all-encompassing. So I'm wondering, in your line of work around analysis and policy, about how much in that government position is this about holding up agriculture? And if those pillars that hold up these producers, are they fragile? Are they solid? So really my question is sort of how much of the onus is on the producer to cut costs and look at those risk management pieces from your standpoint. That's what I'm really curious about, from having you been on both sides of the fence as a producer yourself and in your policy position. Just shed some light on that for me, if you would. Do you understand my question?
I think so.
Okay.
And I guess like you asked what my personal opinion is, and I'm probably not supposed to say that, but like in terms of business risk management principles, one of them is to not adversely affect on-farm decision-making. Like it is the principle and objective is to provide support when needed, but not have unintended consequences or affect business decision-making. And so that is the kind of the policy dance. Again, going back to the problems to solve is getting to support where it's needed, when it's needed, but not otherwise. So thinking back to like, why do these programs exist? What's the social good? Why should taxpayers being supporting these programs? And that'll go back to food security and continuity and business interruption, avoiding those sorts of disruptions for both the economy and for food. So some of those principles are in programmings, for example, in agri-stability, and I'd have to look up the exact details, but if a farm has negative reference margins in 2 out of 3 of their Olympic average reference year, they're not eligible for support, meaning if in the long run this is not a viable business, it's not, the intention of the program is not to continue that business, but to offer natural evolution of businesses to either evolve or change or make other decisions, but to have the program be there to respond in a year of disaster for that farm, who needs it, when they need it, so that crop goes in the ground, the Canadian cow herd maintains, and those sorts of social benefits. Does that kind of answer? Like, is that? I find myself asking that more of like, okay, but like what's the social benefit? What are we trying to achieve? What do Canadians want? Like, my job is to go back to those principles of the program, but even when I look at this data, that's where my mind goes of, okay, if it's right in there to protect grasslands, are these programs doing it? Are these programs serving that purpose for that producer taking responsible care and stewarding those grasslands when they need it in that disaster year? Are they being supported?
Jacques?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My question is about technology. I noticed that on your slide that you discontinued the use of remote sensing for assessment of productivity. Was that a decision based on the inaccuracies that the sensing mechanism could not provide? Or was it just that the insurance provided for precipitation and heat triggers was more reliable? Because I considered, or I thought remote sensing would remove the distortion of assessment of damage to a depredation crop or a hail incident. Is it the failure of the remote sensing mechanism? Thank you.
Yeah, great question. So we had a satellite program for forage insurance in Alberta. It was discontinued. Probably 2 reasons. They're probably related reasons, but participation rates, but also that basis risk or that risk of what's actually happening on the farm and what the metric is predicting or estimating. And our satellite imagery was around NVDI, so trying to capture photosynthesis rates from satellite readings. And when we would evaluate that program, it was not a better predictor in general than the weather station predictor. So like, I agree with your comment that remote sensing, technology is quickly improving, and that's something we need to keep watching, because if that does get to that accurate level and we can measure a field level pasture growth rate, that would be amazing. But with what we had at that point, it wasn't achieving that. So it's something to continually monitor. I mean, I'm not a satellite technology expert, but that world expands so fast. Does it exist out there already? Perhaps. And when it does and when it's effective, we need to A, know about that, and B, incorporate that into programming.
Okay, we'll use you as the last question, I believe, and I have one if I can remember it.
Great, thanks. And thanks, Stuart. I really appreciate how you highlighted the complexity of getting at the actual risks of costs and prices and how that's difficult. And so these two programs in the South don't do that, but maybe still kind of get at other things people are talking about. I was wondering if there's any interest or you're seeing any interest in programs like Sodbuster in the USDA Sodbuster program, which protects land conversion by disincentives for crop production. And then the other one being index insurance, which kind of rewards best management program practices, and so regenerative practices. And if, like, on your farm, for instance, 5.8 soil organic matter versus a 2.8, the weather station would calculate the average payout, and you would get a payout even though you would have produced more forage, and so it turns into almost an incentive to implement best management practices. Probably a lot around that, but yeah, I'm just wondering if there's any interest around those two programs up north.
Yeah, great question. Now we start getting like really technical, and I need to prepare for that. But like what I've seen analysis on Sodbuster is it's not any actual analysis of conversion rates, is it's not a, it has an influence, but it's not a key decision-making factor. I do find it interesting that there are more and more conversations in Canada about that, even with amongst grain producers, like as a general conversation of maybe crop insurance shouldn't be scared of putting guardrails up, and that does seem to be more and more a discourse that's not, you know, it doesn't raise alarm bells amongst farmers. It's a rational decision or a rational discussion. The second question about best management practices within crop insurance, great question. That is something every province, under this Sustainable Canadian Agriculture Partnership, every province across Canada will have to do some sort of pilot of incorporating a best management practice within the crop insurance program and evaluating something that is environmentally beneficial and risk reducing, and figuring out the methodology to capture that within crop insurance premiums and payouts. So that's over till from now. It has to be done by every province by 2028. So that'll be something interesting to follow, and perhaps some cool lessons across Canada amongst crop insurance administrators. You asked about index insurance, and that's an interesting conversation too, because index insurance, there's no practices that reduce from a methodology perspective. Like if the index is based around a satellite reading or a rainfall measurement, like the trigger is the number. It doesn't matter what you incorporate to make a program that's actuarially sound and sustainable. Like the trigger is the trigger, and that's what calculates the numbers. But that does have me thinking, like, is that still an effect on coverage levels in terms of what the expected production of that producer would be? Is that a play within perennial forages and pasture insurance? But yeah, the BMP discussion will be fascinating to watch over the next 3 years across all the different provinces.
He answered some of my question, and the question was, I think you were here 2 or 3 years ago, and you were talking about your soil organic matter rising, the water retention, and the difference in yields on that type of soil and land over land that had a poor or quality organic matter. What has been done with insurance to show the difference? Because if I remember right, you had possibly 5-8 bushels more on a land that had that organic matter built. And is there a different program for those kind of farms?
Yeah, good question and good memory. No, there isn't a different program, but it does tie back to that conversation around BMPs, and each administrator finding something that is reducing risk and environmentally beneficial and trying to incorporate that for lessons within crop insurance. And what I was sharing at that point was how those changes in soil organic carbon were really affecting, or what I was hypothesizing were really affecting the water holding capacity of soil, so that in years of drought, producers with higher soil organic carbon were holding more water, had more moisture available for plant growth, and were not having the losses in yield and triggering indemnities. So are farmers who are storing more soil organic carbon and holding more water, are they saving crop insurance millions and millions of dollars and taxpayers millions and millions of dollars, because that water is still there for plant growth? And that is, in our initial analysis, and analysis since then, working with Kim, and I don't know the data off the top of my head, but it was meaningful and significant. So we evaluated some risk areas in central Alberta and compared fields that were above average in soil organic carbon and those that were below average. And the payouts, the difference in payouts were about $50 an acre on canola in central Alberta. So extrapolating that across canola acreage and that was in 2021's drought year, that could be millions and millions in cost savings, because producers are actually reducing the risk by building their soil. So that could be a part of this BMP analysis.
Yep. Thank you very much, Stuart. I think we'll break for lunch now. Duncan says it's okay.